Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today is our part 4 of our series on PCI. This is a simplified review, the PCI DSS in plain English. Thank you everyone for joining. I would like to introduce Chris Donaldson. He is the team leader here for our PCI practice and is a very knowledgeable member of our team and our expert when it comes to PCI. And I hope you guys enjoyed the content today. You can take it, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Corey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Awesome. Fantastic. So good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are in the world. Good morning or good evening as well. Like Corey said, Chris Donaldson, this is part 4 of our PCI series. We've talked about so far in our journey, just an overview of the DSS, right, and PCI compliance in general. We've talked about what to do, how to prepare for a PCI assessment. We've talked about how to maintain a PCI program, and now we're in part 4, which is okay. We've talked a lot about the DSS and referred to, but what's actually inside of it. Let's talk about some of the details. So the main value that I'd like to be able to provide to this group today is primarily sharing some knowledge with respect to, one, how do I conceptualize the DSS in a way that is beyond just a standard with a bunch of controls, right? From a security perspective, how do I think about it topically? The second piece of value I'd like to provide to y'all is based off of our experience and the number of PCI assessments that we've conducted. Number one, how do we think about testing individual controls? And I'm not going to go into every single thing that we request. However, I wanted to provide some highlights of some things that you may not be considering or thinking about that we typically request as a QSA when doing assessments for the individual requirements. On the other side of that, what are typical findings that we see, or common findings for each by requirement? What are things that you may not be thinking about that would be applicable to your organization? And then the last big bullet point that I'd like to provide in terms of value is with respect to cloud PCI compliance. I know there's been a lot of talk about PCI on the cloud, and a lot of organizations, individuals have trouble conceptualizing PCI on the cloud. So we'll do a quick review of how do we think about PCI compliance in the cloud, or with respect to cloud native architecture, containers and serverless architecture. At the end, we'll leave some time for Q&A. So please, throughout the presentation, throughout the webinar, drop questions in the chat. Corey, who is is managing and is producing this, will feed me questions at the end for us to respond to, and hopefully provide additional value throughout the presentation. Anyway, all right, so we're going to get right into it. So summary of the PCI DSS. I've included no requirement numbers on here, no control numbers. We're just talking concepts. So the PCI DSS, as I've said before, and I'll say again, right, is a fundamental set of security practices applied to a very specific scope of systems, right, namely the ones that affect the security of cardholder data. So how would you actually conceptualize doing that, right, securing card data, right? So number one, you have to harden your environment, right? This is also, this is an ISO, this is an NIST-CSF, right? This is not a new concept. When we say harden the environment, though, that's going to include hardening your network, and it's going to include hardening your systems. When we say hardening means bringing them up to some level of, or some standard of secure. From a systems perspective, for an operating system, this could be based off of a CIS benchmark. For a network, this is based off of individual network hardening standards that you may have, which are informed by PCI and other industry best practices. For applications, it's typically based off of vendor provided best practices, right? So for like a Cisco ASA, Cisco provides security recommendations for hardening at the application level for your firewall, right? On the other side of things, right, or I guess moving on, after you harden your environment, you have to protect PCI data, right? Like the actual data itself. So what does that mean? We're talking about channel level encryption, then we're talking about data level encryption. So for channel level encryption, PCI only cares, at least at this point, there are only requirements around protecting the channel for data being transmitted over an open and public network. This would include Wi-Fi, this would include email, this would include or end user messaging, right, is how PCI describes it. And this is also going to include web traffic, 443 HTTPS traffic. Making sure that you have secure, you're using approved encryption suites, you're using strong encryption keys or strongly encrypted channels. From a data perspective, like, so now we're talking about data at rest, right? So we talked about in flight, now we're talking about protecting data at rest. The other side of protecting PCI data, this is going to be what you would typically consider as, this is like your data encryption, this is key management, it's key custodians, and in cryptography architecture, or cryptographic architecture, it's making sure that only people who should see card data can see card data, and that it's encrypted everywhere at rest, or it's hashed, or tokenized, or what have you. So after we've hardened the network, or after we've hardened the environment, after we've protected PCI data, now we have to implement AV or anti-malware, right? So we're protecting endpoints, servers, and workstations from threats. We have to develop applications securely. So anything that we develop custom, or anything that's on our environment, we have to make sure is patched, and we have to make sure that our secure SDLC is in place. So after our applications, we have to enforce strong identity and access management. Now, IAM is going to be broken down into authorization and authentication. The logging aspect of it comes a little bit later, but authorization translates into really least privilege, enforcing least privilege. And then the authentication aspect of identity and access management is really where we talk about those identity-based controls. Are you using Okta? Are you using, how are you enforcing MFA, things of that nature. After we talk about IAM, we're doing physical security. So the actual physical presence of card data. Now, I know a lot of our, target client market, a lot of the folks that we really try to, or we are really best equipped to serve, and we really focus on developing skills and talent that serve clients are in the high growth tech or high growth B2B SaaS space, right? They're typically cloud first or cloud native. Typically, right? There's some, obviously, that's not everybody, but we really do have a really strong, a lot of value to offer to those clients in particular. And so those clients, if you're in the cloud entirely, your physical CDE may not exist at all, or it may be restricted to just printed forms, which are, for a specific use case. But on the service provider level, this one may not be as applicable if you're entirely in the cloud. After we do the physical security, right, when we think about PCI and securing card data, now we think about, okay, we're doing the logging and monitoring of things. So are all the systems that should be logging actually, are they actually logging? Are they seeing the right data? Are they seeing the right, are the right events being triggered on for logs? And then do we store logs safely and securely? Do we retain them for long enough? Second to last, as we think about the DSS, but also just more conceptually, how do we think about programmatically securing card data? We're thinking about testing the network or testing the environment. So this would include your pen test. This is your rogue AP scanning. This is your vulnerability scanning, both external and internal. This is your IDS IPS. This is your file integrity monitoring. And then lastly, after all of the stuff that we just talked about, we talk about the foundation of everything, which is your security program. This is your risk assessment, your policies and procedures. It's all the documentation that really stands up your security program, including your IR policies and procedures, as well as your vendor management stuff. So that's in a nutshell. This is actually the DSS. All these correlate directly to requirements in different places in the DSS. I've tried to turn them into a lot more tangible ways of thinking about things and remove the requirement numbers so you can think about it more in concepts versus actual control numbers. So it's not as intimidating. But that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about PCI DSS. And this is it. Everything inside the DSS falls in these categories in some way. So I guess that, just to reiterate the point, the PCI DSS is fundamental security best practices applied to systems and processes that can affect the security of card data. So security best practices applied to a very specific set of systems, specifically the ones that can affect the security of card data. it's no more than that, right? We're not talking about integrity. We're not talking about, maybe they should say confidentiality of card data, just to be a bit even more specific, right? So the confidentiality, we're not talking about integrity. We're not talking about availability. I say this often kind of as a joke. However, the PCI Council, the PCI DSS does not care, based on the DSS, if your data center is a crater, if it got hit by a meteor and was completely wiped out, as long as there was no PCI data disclosed in either that process or in the rebuild, then you have not violated PCI compliance. So there's no integrity aspect to it. There's no business continuity aspect of it, right? So it's very specific. However, what I mean by this, when I say fundamental security best practices, I do want you to hear me, is that nothing that we just discussed, nothing that we just reviewed in terms of the controls should be is excessive or should be overkill, right? That's at least the intent. Everything that we've discussed, I'll go back to it, right? So securing your network, right? That's a given. Everyone should be doing that. Hardening your systems, everyone should be doing that. Encrypting card data, whether it's being transmitted over the internet or if it's stored in a database. That's, again, this is basic blocking and tackling. Least privilege, having endpoint security, securely developing applications, securing your physical environment, data center, physical card data, doing logging, monitoring, testing your environment, having a security program. All of these things are basic blocking and tackling when it comes to a successful, capable security program. So I'd hear a lot from clients, especially ones that are very new to PCI, that PCI is excessive, and I think that people can overly apply controls, but the DSS, what's actually it's asking you to do in terms of the controls themselves, are simply security best practices, and that's because the DSS really, at the end of the day, is based on other industry standards that precede PCI DSS, such as NIST standards, such as ISO and things of that nature. So the extra mile, right, for servers, shared hosting providers, just want to make sure I didn't leave y'all out, right? Your objectives, in addition to everything we just talked about, you really are also caring about protecting, all the hosted entities from each other. You care about protecting yourself from the entities in your environment, right? So that they can't compromise you, they can't compromise other entities that you host. You care about making sure you can monitor entities and the activity based off of what they're doing, and then that you can support a forensic investigation in the event of any entity compromise. So with that, I want to jump in, and I do want to spend the majority of the time that we have, and I don't think I'll take the entirety of the time it's blocked. I'll do my best to be pretty quick about this, and not read everything. This content should be available. Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, but we are going to post this content as available for download at some point, correct?
Yeah, correct. We'll have the YouTube video up next week, and the content all will be available on the website within the next month.
Okay, great, cool. So yeah, all this will be available. So feel free to go and download it on the website after it gets posted. So I want to go through some highlights now, just so I don't read everything and bore everyone. So when we talk about requirement 1, right, I'm going to go through typically what are some things to think about that we're going to request if we were assessing you, right, or if your QSA assesses you. What are things we're going to ask for, look to see, and what are some common findings that we typically see when it comes to gaps or problems, something that would prevent you from being able to file as compliant, right? So for requirement 1, I would say prioritize making a very good network diagram that features, where it's going to include your DMZ architecture on there. It's going to include where your security controls, your IDS taps, where your firewalls are. It's going to include the different network zones, what's PCI, what's not PCI, your FLOD and slot and SLOD architecture, all of that. Where external entities come in, where egress traffic goes to third parties as well. all of that should be in your network diagram. So the more detailed you can make your network diagram, not detailed, but not convoluted, right? So the more detailed you can make your network diagram, the easier time you're going to have with your assessment. That is because your QSA can look at one document and base questions off of that rather than trying to pull out a bunch of things, right? So from a QSA's perspective, if I don't see on paper that you have something well documented, my first assumption is that you don't know either what's happening in real life or it wasn't really planned out very well. So documentation is very helpful from an ease of your assessment. Common gaps we typically see, one is, as I just mentioned, the network diagram really does not focus on the CVE, it's missing security controls, it really wasn't well thought out, or it was a very, very complicated network diagram that had no security focus on it, or no PCI relevant information. That's probably one of the bigger things, right? Other things we typically see are missing or poorly reviewed firewall rules that allow default allow all egress traffic, because folks generally focus on ingress traffic versus in addition to focusing on egress or not focusing on egress traffic as well, or their DMZ architecture is not very well articulated. Requirement 2 is, this one again, requirement 1 was around hardening your network. Requirement 2 is around hardening your systems. If you hear nothing else, please, when I come into your environment, I am expecting that you have a definition for every system component. When I say system component, I mean Unix, whatever that flavor of Unix is, or Windows, whatever flavor of Windows is, or your domain controllers, like whatever you have in your environment topically, you have defined what hardened or secured means for each of those system components, and you are in some way monitoring or have a stance on whether those systems are compliant to the standard you have set, whether it be a CIS benchmark that you've just taken off the shelf and applied, whether it's some other industry standard. Like, you have a definition of what secured or hardened means for the systems that we're talking about. So that is I expect that every time I go into an environment, and common finding is I don't see that very often, or rather it's I see that is probably one of the major things I see missing when I test requirement 2, is that an organization for a particular technology has not defined what secured or hardened means, or they've defined it but they have no idea, or they have no way of communicating that those systems are meeting that standard. I see that quite often. I generally see it less when it comes to operating systems, so Windows and Unix. I would say most organizations have at least defined what hardened means. I would say fewer understand if they're compliant with that definition on an ongoing basis. And I would say it's much more rare to find organizations that have defined what secured or hardened means for, let's say, a Kubernetes environment, or for AWS, or for Azure, or GCP, or for an on-prem deployment of something. Those are situations where I don't see clients defining what secured mean that also need to be secured. Similarly, firewalls or routers or application environments, maybe ESXi, those I generally don't see, or not generally, I see much more commonly that those are missing a definition of secured, because it actually takes a bit more effort than just pulling a CIS benchmark off the shelf. Excuse me. So for requirement 3, again, just to run it back, as review, requirement 3 is where we're talking about, okay, under the header of securing PCI data or protecting the actual data, requirement 3 is protecting the data at rest. So this is data in databases, it's data in flat files, it's data in shared drives. That's what we're talking about here. So number 1, just generally, right, make sure you never have any SAD in your environment. Like, SAD is sensitive authentication data. It's PIN or PIN block. It's CVV2. or sensitive authentication data, right? Every card has its own name for it, whether it be CVC2 or CVV2 or CID or what have you, right? We all know what we're talking about. It's that 3 or 4 digit number on the other front if it's an Amex card, at the back if it's a Visa MasterCard, that you use for card not present transactions, typically e-commerce. Make sure you have evidence confirming that you don't have any sensitive authentication data in your environment, right? When you say confirming, you need to have at least a perspective. Like you need to have some evidence that supports a stance of, we don't have this at rest in our environment. Your QSA may ask you to refine that and may ask for additional areas, but come to the table with some sort of evidence-based stance on you not having that in your environment at rest after authorization. I want to go to the bottom of this list though and just point out that probably the biggest area of focus that many organizations miss is I'm going to request, and I need to see as your assessor, key management policies and procedures or standards, however you want to use the nomenclature. But for requirements 3.5 and 3.6, which is around key management, key generation, protecting keys, split knowledge, dual control, all of that. Make sure you have that documented and make sure that you have evidence supporting that documentation is actually in place in production. Common findings, obviously the corollary to that is we don't see that, or we tend to see that as a gap more often than other things when it comes to requirement 3. The other thing that we see as a gap many times with respect to requirement 3 is organizations having unencrypted CHD in flat files or shared drives. It's very easy, or it's typically a lot more visible to know about card data that's stored in a database, because a table had to be there and a column had to be created and there's application calls to it. So it's a lot more known from a technical perspective. However, card data in flat files or card data in shared drives, there's no, it's unstructured data. So the data center is not, there's a table for it, there's no format for it. It's going to be, it could be in there, could not be in there. That is probably the area we do find more often than not. If there is unencrypted card data, it's in one of those two places. Organizations tend to do a pretty good job with respect to encrypting cardholder data, especially nowadays with PII and privacy laws being so coming up and being so prevalent. Focus on protecting card data at rest in a database in a structured way. We tend to see not many gaps with respect to that. Sometimes with respect to the key management side of things from a documentation perspective, but not necessarily in practice as much. Unstructured data though still continues to be an area that we see gaps because it's elusive, unless you have a DLP solution running or something. From a requirement 4 perspective, this one's pretty straightforward. I generally don't see many problems with requirement 4. The only times would be if an organization is using an outdated version of TLS or SSL, which means that at one point the website or the public-facing website they were using was transmitting data over a secured line, but it just hasn't been updated in a number of years, and consequently the encryption protocols for that web traffic is now been not deprecated, but is now vulnerable. Vulnerabilities have been found in it, so it simply needs to be updated. Requirement 5. So requirement 5, if anyone, I would love to, at some point we need to figure out how to have call and response and do some questions in here, because I would love to quiz the audience periodically. But for now, requirement 5 is around antivirus, anti-malware. Again, I generally don't see many gaps here, save for when an organization has made a decision to not deploy anti-malware or antivirus onto something because they think, or someone thought, that system was not susceptible to viruses or malware. We see this in containerized environments more and more now, where organizations have made, or we see it still for Linux, that some organizations say that Linux systems don't need antivirus or anti-malware, but they don't have any sort of risk-based analysis or research or any testing to support that assertion. They've simply made the assertion that this system doesn't need antivirus, anti-malware, EDR, whatever you want to use, and has proceeded based off of simply that assertion. So if you, to everyone on the call or everyone on the webinar, whoever listens to this, if you're going to not put AV, EDR, anti-malware onto a system, make sure you have a very strong case as to why that is backed up with evidence, some sort of testing, some sort of evidence to support that. Your word or your perspective simply is not sufficient for what a QSA is going to need to see to accommodate not putting AV or anti-malware on a system. Requirement 6, this one is around secure SDLC. So this one is around developing systems securely. It's your DevSecOps process, change tickets, secure coding, code reviews, things of that nature. 2 areas I want to highlight here, just to dive into real quick. When it comes to applications and it comes to patching, this also includes dependencies in application code. So if you are using, if you're using open source code or open source components, whether it be libraries or binaries or whatever it is in your application, which most applications these days are using some form of that, you have to be able to show me that those components do not have any open vulnerabilities in them that you're not tracking as a part of your vulnerability, that are not in a violation of your vulnerability management SLAs, meaning we remediate criticals in 2 weeks or 30 days, we remediate highs in 60 days, or whatever it is, right? Which means that you need to have awareness and visibility into the dependencies in your code, and what the vulnerabilities are associated with those dependencies. This is something that not a lot of organizations, or rather, this is something that we do see relatively routinely in terms of findings that organizations have to fix and remediate, either because they don't have visibility into their dependencies, or they do. There's just so many vulnerabilities in their dependencies that they're not able at the time of the assessment, or they weren't able at the time of the assessment to remediate all of the ones that needed remediation. Other areas that we see that I'm going to look for here is, at the end of the day, with respect to requirement 6, I want to know that you're not deploying vulnerable code into production. That's really, or there's not vulnerable code in production, right? But more specifically, I'm looking that you're not deploying vulnerable code into production, either knowingly or unknowingly. So you need to have some sort of security gate or multiple gates, whether this is when you do pull requests or right before you deploy, deploy into production, where you have a review of application code, application security, to identify any vulnerabilities prior to that application being deployed in production, in which you will not deploy a certain threshold of vulnerabilities into production. So just to read that back simply, I need to see as your QSA that you are not deploying vulnerabilities, or at least a certain level of vulnerabilities, into production, right? There may be a low vulnerability that, based off of your risk acceptance, or your risk, your vulnerability management process, you're willing to deploy, right? That's your prerogative. But I generally will not, pass an organization if they have critical or high vulnerabilities in their code in production, or if they don't know if they have high or critical vulnerabilities in production. So that is, that's the stance that we take, simply because there's just a ton of risk there. Other areas that we do see organizations maybe having gaps is in the absence of a web application firewall in front of their public-facing web applications that are in scope for PCI. I suppose that this is maybe just because it's not on their radar. Generally, our clients, because they are service providers, as awareness, PCI 4.0 is not going to allow you to do web application assessments in order to accommodate that, that rule. Like you have to have pretty much a WAF using in PCI 4.0, so you have a little bit more time. If you're not, tracking towards that, but just want to put it on your radar that is changing in the future. Requirement 7, this one essentially is around least privilege. Do you have authorization to view this information or to do this action? What I'm going to ask for when I come into your environment to do testing is, okay, on paper, for one, I want to know all the roles that have access to the CDE. Which one of those are administrative access? Who should be included in those groups, or who should have access to those roles? And then I need evidence to show me that reality reflects what you have on paper. That if only sysadmins should be a part of the cloud admins group, then there shouldn't be anyone in accounting in that group. That's what I need to see. I need to see you've defined what it should be, and that you've implemented, or you're compliant to what you've defined in the systems currently. That's probably the biggest area that we see, right? Is that an organization actually hasn't made the definition of what things should be, who should have access, what access should those roles have. We do see overly permissive access. We do see missing or insufficient access request tickets. The ones that typically concern me are when an organization has not defined what things should be, because I have very little to compare my sampling to or my assessment to when I examine those systems. Requirement 8, so we just talked about the authorization portion, right? That least privilege. Now requirement 8 is it's where we do the system controls, the identity-based controls. It is the password parameters. It's the login parameters. This is where we talk about generic and shared IDs as well, right? So more often than not, things we find with respect to requirement 8 are going to be, one-off. Hey, this password complexity was set to, it's only 6 characters long versus 7 characters, or it didn't have enough complexity, or the lockout period wasn't long enough. We either see that as findings, or we see generic or shared IDs as findings. But most organizations nowadays that we see have some sort of MFA in place. They have a process for authenticating individuals. They have a process for admins to be able to access CDE systems in a secure way using either a jump server, a bastion host, or some other mechanism, right? So requirement 8 is generally the things that are more one-offs. They're not generally systemic issues that we see when testing this one in requirement 8. And that's the authentication control. So requirement 9 is the physical security side of things. Again, most of the folks who may be on this webinar, or at least the folks that we generally see as in our client profiles, are in that high growth B2B SaaS space, or they're more so in the cloud. So physical security with respect to the CDE is not as much of a concern, because they just don't have a physical. All their data is in the cloud. All their systems are in AWS, Azure, GCP, and because they're service providers, most of them don't have card data that they would interact with intentionally anyway. They would be interacting with card data incidentally because they're providing a platform as a service to do something else, or they're providing a security service that helps an organization satisfy PCI, but they're never touching card data themselves. All right, requirement 10 is probably the area we see the requirement 2, requirement 10 tend to be the areas that we see some of the most gaps, because they tend to be the ones that, in my view, are some of the most significant with respect to risk reduction. I think requirement 6 can go in there as well, based off of our client profile that we typically see. So number one, I'm going to ask for, so requirement 10 is logging and monitoring, just for anyone who didn't know. I'm going to ask for when I come in, okay, what should be sending logs? What should be generating security logs for your organization, right? For your PCI environment. This would be all the systems that, either touching card data or in your CDE directly, and it's going to be the ones that are providing some sort of critical security function, like a firewall, like your IDS IPS, like your FIM if you have, like your FIM potentially, or your any other, maybe your EDR solution, your AV, things of that nature. So all of the, I want to see a list of what should be sending logs to our environment to be monitored for anomalous activity. I want to see evidence that all of the security events that PCI requires are actually being logged with the required data for a sample set of systems. And I'll pick out some of those systems and I'll request that data. But those are the two major things that I'm looking for. What findings that typically occur when testing requirement 10 for clients is they don't actually have a list of what should be logging to their logging and monitoring environment. They generally they just don't have that. They may not be sending logs to a centralized environment. They may have multiple different places that their security logs for their PCI environment are actually kept. Or not all the systems, when we actually look under the hood, not all the systems that they said should be sending security logs are sending security logs. This can be due to some misconfiguration along the way. This can be due to a change that happened that the logs were sending at one point, but they've since stopped because, I don't know, an application changed the format of the logs and consequently it broke the indexes. We see this with Splunk every so often. So those are probably the biggest things that we see with respect to this. In terms of storage, we do see sometimes that clients are not storing card data for a year or not. It doesn't have 90 days on tap. Those changes are typically minor, and I don't count them as on the same level of severity, but in terms of impact as some of those other ones that I just mentioned. Requirement 11, this is testing, right? So this is constantly stressing your environment, your network, to identify gaps in security that need to be fixed that would have been missed elsewhere. The two big ones here, right? I would say most organizations do rogue IP scans where applicable. I mean, organizations do internal vuln scans, they do external vuln scans, they do pen tests, they do segmentation tests. I'm going to look for specifically, though, that your FIM is in place, and that whatever is coming out of that FIM, those reports are being triaged. And with respect to your IDS IPS, I put particular focus on making sure that your IDS IPS, whatever you're doing, right, is monitoring both north-south traffic as well as east-west traffic in your CDE. Organizations typically get the north-south, but they typically miss the east-west portion of that. So I look for both. And when I say north-south, I mean ingress and egress into your PCI zone, and then east-west is connectivity or traffic between systems inside of that environment. From a common findings perspective, lack of network segmentation. This one's not a PCI control necessarily. There's no control number that requires PCI networks or network segmentation. However, to have your scope actually be what you want it to be requires network segmentation 99 times out of 100. Often, if we have a finding in requirement 11, if it's not, you don't have FIM or your IDS IPS is not providing sufficient coverage, it's going to be we will see network segmentation as a finding. Not that it prevents you from being compliant necessarily, it isn't a violation, but it means that systems that you don't want tested or you weren't prepared to be tested for PCI compliance now would be required to show compliance as well. And this is typically overly burdensome in organizations can't meet that threshold. It's a high bar. Requirement 12, this is your information security program, right? Making sure that that is in place and operating effectively. I'm going to look for probably one of the first things I'm going to look for is your security risk assessment, your cybersecurity risk assessment with CDE relevant information, which includes all the required fields. Now, for years, organizations have been very, I won't say hand wavy, but fast and loose with respect to what a risk assessment is. And I accommodate the how did we get here portion, pretty much, or a lot of the time. What I'm very inflexible on is that risk assessments, whatever you show me, must confirm that you have done analysis of critical asset. You have documented and done analysis that consider critical assets, threats, vulnerabilities, and then the corresponding risks based off of those, and you have some sort of action based on those risks, right? We're either going to accept the risk, we're going to mitigate the risk, we're going to transfer the risk, right? I need to see that that was done. I'm going to also look for evidence on your third-party risk management process. I'm going to look for evidence on your incident response program. Big major, when we see gaps, typically it's going in requirement 12. Typically, it's going to be a missing or inadequate security risk assessment. It may be missing documentation for what PCI responsibilities your third parties have. For service providers, right, it may be that you actually have not defined what your PCI responsibilities are to your customers, right? That is a PCI requirement for you. We like to see it in terms of a roles and responsibilities matrix, wherefore, the controls you have said, customer is doing this, is responsible for this one, we're responsible for this one, or we have shared responsibility in the case of maybe system hardening or things of that nature, right? So again, I didn't want to read through all of those, but that's the summary of what we see, lessons learned, what we ask for when it comes to assessments, to give you a lot more detail and look under the hood of how we operate. Lastly, I know we have about 13 minutes left. I do want to leave time for questions. When it comes to the cloud, I'll just leave at some point in the future, probably into Q1 or Q2 of next year, we'll do an entire webinar around PCI cloud considerations, right, with respect to containers or serverless environments. But to summarize, if you're operating a PCI environment in the cloud, number one is don't forget to harden your cloud environment itself using a CIS benchmark or something of the sort, right? CIS has AWS benchmarks, it has Azure benchmarks for what you should be doing to secure your cloud environment. Number two, or if you're using it, if you're containerized, right? If you're having a container architecture for PCI application in the cloud or on-prem or what have you, you need runtime monitoring, right? You need to have visibility into what's going on in the container runtime. Your vulnerability scanner is not going to give you visibility into what's going on there. You have to, you also have to have interpod rules that need to be reviewed and hardened, right? Your security policies for your pods must be reviewed and must be solid. But strongly recommend having your own, if you don't have one already, a container security standard that is set up that says, hey, these are the things that we have to have or must be in our YAML when it comes to the security policies as we define them. You must harden your K8s environment, right? If you're using Kubernetes, right, or equivalent, right? If you're using whatever you would be using, this, alternative to that. But make sure you're hardening that environment as well. I mean, basically, if it has security policies or a way of like enforcing security, like you need to harden it if it's in scope for PCI. And if you're running containers, if containers in your Kubernetes environment have PCI data going through them, or supporting a customer's PCI environment, right? Those are in scope for PCI. If you're serverless, right? I mean, again, harden the environment running the serverless workloads. I kind of allude to the ones previously. And then lastly, your secure software development lifecycle for whatever you're running in a serverless environment, it becomes extremely paramount at that point, right? Including if you're using, like discrete functional workloads like a lambda or functions. So with that, that's the content that we had today with respect to, or a very plain English review of the PCI DSS. I know it's very dense, and I know it's a lot, but I did try to simplify it into those, just categorically make it easier to consume. I wanted to provide a list of what we typically ask for, what we typically see in terms of findings, as well as some additional context there, and then some cloud considerations as you consider PCI in the cloud. So with that, Corey, I know we have about 10 minutes left. Did you want to look through and ask me questions?
Yeah, so if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them, and we'll get to them in the order they come to. Okay, so we have our first question is it illegal to use the PCI DSS logo on my website to indicate that I am compliant?
Is it illegal? So PCI has an FAQ around this. I would say it's not illegal because the PCI SSC is not a legal entity. It's not law enforcement, right? So you're not breaking the law necessarily. Is it a violation of terms? I believe so, but I'd have to check the FAQ in order to confirm. I know that organizations can put the PCI logo on their website if they have gotten explicit permission to do so from the council. So if you'd like to put the PCI compliant logo on your website, you have to get permission to do so from the council.
Okay, the next question, and guys, please feel free to ask the questions that you have. Can you recommend any tools that can make facilitate a PCI audit easier?
Yeah, of course. So I take a firm stance that for your organization to successfully be able to do PCI and maintain a program, you have got to have some sort of GRC tool or tooling to do so. Excel will not cut it. Risk 360 does have a GRC tool called Phalanx, which is available in different tiered models or tiered subscriptions based off of what your needs are. The scaling version is probably the best when it comes to PCI, just because of the comprehensive modules and access that you get. But outside of that particular recommendation, I would say a GRC tool is necessary, and a competent team to implement your program inside that tool.
All right, and the next question, is it good to be an early adopter of PCI DSS 4.0?
So if what I heard was, is it good to be an early adopter for 4.0?
Yes.
I'd probably say no. So I'll say this: I would not necessarily file compliance early for PCI DSS 4.0. I would, however, do your readiness assessment as soon as possible. So what the distinction between those two things is, a readiness assessment is essentially an internal assessment against 4.0, where you're not attesting to being compliant against it. There's no filing. There's really there's no formalized report, but you are getting the benefits of somebody checking to confirm if you are your compliance posture against 4.0, because it's so different from 3.2.1. So I would not file for compliance formally until you absolutely have to, but I would do your readiness assessment, which is internal only, or internally facing only. You can obviously have a contractor or a consultant or whomever facilitate that if you don't have the capacity or capabilities to do it on your own. But I would do that portion as soon as possible, so you have enough time to remediate things in advance of when you actually have to do it.
All right, so the next question, if our org doesn't have budget plan for implementing commercial FIM solutions, what are the open source FIM would you recommend and comply to PCI?
So you do not necessarily have to purchase a FIM solution to be compliant for requirement 11.5, control 11.5. We have seen organizations successfully implement verbose enough logging and monitoring to satisfy the intent of file integrity monitoring, meaning they have implemented logging, or they have jobs running locally that monitor for changes to different file directories. Those, if those changes occur, a log is sent to their logging environment, or a manual report, or an email is generated, or a message is sent to whatever environment or whoever is being looking for things or on the hook to look. They would notify them that they need to do some investigation on a particular system.
Okay.
But I don't have necessarily an open source recommendation for FIM to you. I would say if you're in that position, that you have an opportunity to configure local jobs or more enhanced logging to run to provide the functionality you need.
All right, our next question is, can you touch on the problems you normally see with merchants who have a payment provider and think that the service provider does PCI DSS?
Sorry, can you read that question again?
All right, can you touch on the problems you normally see with merchants who have a payment provider and think that the, I guess, payment provider has PCI DSS? I guess the question, and Drew, please correct us if you can, I believe the question is you're a merchant and you're working with a payment provider and you don't know if your payment provider actually is PCI DSS. What should you do to check, or if they're not, what to do?
Got it. Okay. So if you're working with we'll just say any service provider, right? If you already are working with them, or if you're looking to contract with them and you have an NDA in place, it should be well within your rights to request their attestation of compliance. Their attestation of compliance, they call it an AOC, will have their compliance information and summary on there. At the end, showing if they're actually compliant or not currently. You can also go to Visa's website if it's a payment service provider or a service provider having to do with payments. On Visa's website, there are Visa service providers, or there's a listing of the service providers that Visa has that are filed as compliant to PCI on their website. We can put that resource in the description of the video whenever we post it. But that's also a resource that we actually use quite often when a client is saying they're using X, Y, or Z company to facilitate payments on their behalf. We check and see if they're compliant as well when we work with merchants. So that's what I would say. Request an AOC. If they're not compliant, I would recommend. I mean, I don't want to say don't work with them necessarily, but that's definitely a risk as to why they're not compliant, especially if they're a payment service provider. And at the end of the day, you can also check the Visa website, this Visa service provider's website, to see what their compliance status is.
Okay, I think it's a little bit, yeah, I think you clarified. See, Drew had a little clarification. He said the provider believes that they don't have your responsibilities regarding PCI DSS.
Okay, I would be, Drew, to that one, I would be very interested to know, if I was you, what their rationale is for why, especially if they're touching card data that you're especially if you know that they're touching card data. But if it's known to both parties that they're touching card data, they are responsible for PCI compliance. That they're responsible for PCI compliance. It's definitely within your right to demand that.
Okay, and all right, here's our last question. We got 1 minute. How do I get Risk 360 to be my PCI monitor?
Yeah, so on our website, there's a contact us link. Feel free to shoot us a note. We'd be happy to reach out we'd be happy to discuss your needs and to make sure that like what we have to offer and our capabilities meets your needs. But yeah, I would just say go to our website and shoot us a note. We'll be happy to engage and set up a call.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks, Chris, for the great content. Once again, this concludes our 4-part series, but next year we have more PCI content coming out around 4.0. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.